I am Gordon Conway. I am like many other people, I'm a former president, but in this case, I'm a former president of the Royal Geographical Society. So I'm a former president of all the countries in the world, and therefore take precedence this afternoon. I would like to thank Ismail Serageldin for inviting me to become a member of the Board of Trustees of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. We have known each other for a long time, and it's a great privilege to be here on the board and to take part in this session. The objective of this session is to look at past history of terrorism and to see what it is we can learn. You might say that there is nothing new in terrorism. It may well be that my ancestors 2,000 years ago were acting as terrorists against the Roman Empire. We've probably all got a long history back to periods of unrest. But in particular, these notes say that we should be looking perhaps at the OAS in France, FARC in Colombia, which was one of the longest periods of terrorism before it reached a resolution only a year ago. Well, actually, yes, a year ago. Now. And GIA in Algeria and Jamaat Islamiyah in Egypt. I would add to those the kinds of terrorism that were occurring during the decolonization process from Western powers. In terms of Britain and the British Empire, there was terrorism in Malaya and in Kenya in particular. But there was also independence gained without terrorism. For example, from Ghana, in Pakistan and India. And I suppose if you go back far enough, the Americans didn't use very much terrorism to become independent from Britain. It was only a very little, actually. So they should be congratulated on their efforts. There is also the experience in Ireland, which interests me in part because I am partly Irish. There was a degree of uprising that led to the creation of the Republic of Ireland. And then, more recently, the terrorism sponsored by the IRA, countered by unionist groups, which caused enormous, enormous tragedy over many, many years. It took a long time to resolve. And I think one of the issues to look at is, why did that terrorism get resolved? And I think my own view in part is because the people of both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland gained greater prosperity because they became members of the European Union. And they had a view of a much larger world and a much larger horizon to which they could aspire. And the question we have to ask is whether these previous examples can provide any light on what is happening today and how the terrorist situations today can be resolved. President Josipovic said that one difference from the past and now is that terrorists were now much more organized. I guess that's true in part, although of course there were many terrorist groups that had really quite sophisticated organizations in the 20th century and before. What I think is different now is where terrorist groups have actually created effective quasi-states. And as he also said, the importance of modern communication and modern professionalism. There's much greater professionalism, if you like, about the terrorism of today. Maybe that's not the right word, but it's one that is a shorthand for what we see there. But I think it's also true that although this is more organized, even though it's more a function of a quasi-state, it draws on support. Draws on support from marginalized people. It draws on support from those who are left behind. It draws on support of those who've got grievances. And for those people who either do not have democratic champions or believe they do not have democratic champions. It is in part a reflection of this distinction, as President Jamal said, between the poor and the rich, and the local and the global, and the disenfranchised and the franchised. We are also asked if we would look in the past at the difference between democratic and centralized power in dealing with terrorism. One of the questions, of course, one should ask is, which is more efficient? Which is more effective? Dealing with terrorism from a democratic base or from a centralized power base? What about the length of time? Does it take longer from a more democratic base than from a more centralized base? There's also the question of the morality of the methods used. Are the methods more moral in a democratic state than it is in a centralized state? And of course, the issue of civil rights. There are more civil rights, inevitably, in a more democratic and centralized power. There's also the question of sustainability. When you have resolved this situation, how sustainable is it? Is it more sustainable in a democratic than in a centralized state? And then there is the issue of what kind of resolution occurs. The language we keep talking, and it's in this background here, is of defeat. Is that what it's about? Are we talking about defeat of terrorism? Are we talking about overcoming terrorism? Or are we talking about resolving the issues in the center of terrorism? What is it that in the past has brought about a cessation of terrorism? Is it ideas? Is it human rights? Is it economic needs, satisfying economic needs? Is it about education? Is it about reform of governance? And so on. Just one final point. President Jamal talked about citizen states as being part of a solution. I just wonder where we have examples in the past. The only one I can think of is South Africa, where certainly the terrorism wasn't extreme, but it was there, and it was the creation of the citizen state at the end of apartheid, which probably has produced a more sustainable approach. Those are just some thoughts of mine. I have here three excellent people to join me. First of all, I have on my right President Rosalia, former president of Ecuador, and I'm delighted that she is here. I have further on my right Dr. Lobna Shatab, who is an Algeria researcher and media expert. And on my left is Dr. Khalid Azab, who's in the Central Projects and Services sector of the Bibliotheca. And I also have an excellent rapporteur, Ms. Shahira Amin, who is, many as you know, is an Egyptian journalist and a senior anchor. And I think in some respects she ought to be here and I ought to be there. But if there's time at the end, we will turn to her for her comments. We have, I left my watch behind, but somebody will have to tell me. I want to finish exactly at the latest on 7:30 so that we're ready for dinner. Can I now turn to you, please, President Rosalia? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Gordon, and thanks to Ismail Serageldin for the invitation, and also to Robshan Murabdo from the Ningsami Ganjabi Center. What a big challenge we have to talk about if we learn from history or we learn from the past and how we can improve and make it better than in the past. I used to say that I started my career being a high school teacher of history. And of course, I was trying to make it better, how to teach the history to my students. I try to do it in a very nice way, that they enjoy the history, and probably I was more successful than others. But I was also remembering what I saw in recent days, an American movie called The Imperials Club. I don't know if you see sometime, it's a 2002 movie. And I saw that a professor, a teacher of preparatory school, was trying to teach values to the students. And he had several students. He achieved a lot with most of the students, except with one. One of them was not a good student. He was trying to make a lot of tricks, and finally he appears to be the most successful in class. He won some prizes, but all the students, including the teachers, knows that he was not doing right things. That could be an example about how can teachers on one side and parents in the other side can have together a work to achieve a better society, a better world. The father of the student was a politician, and he was pushing the son to do things in the wrong way. That was the conclusion of that movie. Then I have to consider that if we put a lot of effort in educational issues, we can solve most of the problems, but not all the problems. When I was reading the part of this convocatory when it says that we have to analyze what happens in the past, I can very fast talk about what's happening in Latin America, because it's my continent. And here it's mentioned the oldest guerrilla of the world, FARC in Colombia. Apparently it is going to an end the conflict, apparently, because we know that the population of Colombia says no to the signing of the agreement in the conditions that they were presented by President of Colombia. He won the Nobel Prize. He was laureated by the Peace Prize. But in Colombia, citizens all over the country are concerned about what's going to happen. And we, in the borders, countries like Ecuador, or Peru, or Brazil, we are concerned also about how it can develop and how it can impact. Because many times the guerrilla can be transformed in a common crime. It happens in Central America after the signing of the peace between the guerrilla of Guatemala and the army of Guatemala. I was there when it was signed, and I was testimony of the signing of the peace. But when you saw the parameters of the life in Guatemala or Salvador, you can say it's not so successful as it appears. I listened to one of the panelists of the previous panel talking about that the actual or the current situation of the criminal or guerrilla or of the groups is different than in the past century, and mentioned some facts. Maybe I can mention one that is a very big fact: technology. Technology in hands of criminal minds can be the worst thing that could happen. One of my friends attended one of the last meetings in Las Vegas about new technologies, robots robots could have also criminal minds, apparently, because we are talking about artificial intelligence. And these robots with weapons in hands of criminal minds could be a mess. And in that sense, the future is not a positive future. But in other hands, I am the one that I always think in positive, trying to put a big effort on educational issues. If we can guide the people, the young students, women and men, about inclusion, about tolerance, about the prevalence of good, not against the bad things, we can do a better job. Last year, we talked at Library of Alexandria about how we think, or how we could think democracy. And I was very impacted about the lottery of democracy that we talked last year. And I suggest that thematic to some young leaders in Mexico, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and they get a lot of interest. I really think that we have to be more creative and to propose new ways to think the democracy, the values of democracy, and how we can work in this uncertain world that we are living now to have a better world. Education is one, non-inclusion, other, tolerance, and of course, using the technology and the capacities of the human beings to create a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask you a bit about the FARC in Colombia? I mean, why is it that it's got close to being resolved? I mean, it's gone on for, what, 20 years or more?
Well, if you ask some of the leaders of Colombia, you can have opposite theories.
Right.
Some of them, probably President Pastrana, that is also part of the board of Bibliotheca Alexandrina, he's against the signing of the peace in these conditions, because saying that there is too much that is given to the guerrilla, including the possibility to be part of the Senate without elections, without winning elections. A lot of possibilities to the guerrilla, and what happens with the people that suffer from the guerrilla, because there are thousands of people that died because of the guerrilla. Other persons like President Santos and a lot of Colombians says that that's the only way to achieve peace, because they tried many things. Plan Colombia, that was supported by the government of the United States with a lot of money, with a lot of weapons. Well, we are, all of us, especially in Latin America, we are very curious and expecting what can result from these negotiations. Last year, it was a referendum, a call to the people, and everybody was convinced that the people of Colombia was going to say yes, sign the peace, but they didn't. The no option won. And it's, again, a new discussion about what's going to happen, and they are modifying some of the chapters of the agreement. FARC is not the only group of guerrilla in Colombia. There is another group, ALN, old, also not as old as FARC. They are starting to negotiate in my own country, in Ecuador. Ecuador offers the land of Ecuador to have that negotiation. The other negotiation with FARC is in La Habana, where they continue. The chiefs of FARC are living in Habana, and they are having a good quality of life, apparently, there. But in Colombia, there are also other groups, paramilitares, that apparently they disappeared in one time, but they continue.
But just go back. Why did it get to the point that there was a possible resolution? I mean, did the terrorists or just get exhausted? I mean, why did that happen?
Well, it's a long story. President Uribe fought very hard with weapons against the guerrilla, and finally they lose territory because they were in the past winning a lot of territory. They were reduced to some part of the territory. They lose a lot of credibility because they are not more the idealistic guerrilla. They are partners of the cartels of mafia, of drug, coca drug, and
that's another point.
That's another ingredient.
That's right. There are always other ingredients. I mean, in Ireland, it is very much about drug gangs and so on these days. I'd love to come back to some of these questions, particularly why Guatemala doesn't look as though it's going to be sustainable as far as you're concerned. But we'll come back to that maybe later if we've got some time. But let me now turn to Dr. Lobner. Would you please like to say what you were prepared to do?
I will speak about Algerian experience.
Yes, please.
And let me just talk in Arabic. Thank you so much, Mr. President. I want to thank Alexandria Bibliotheca. I want to thank all the participants here today. Here we are talking about the Arab culture with the other cultures as well, to talk about the Arab experiences. And for me as an Algerian, Algeria is considered as an interesting example when it comes to democracy. It passes through painful and very sad story, but again, there are a lot of experiences and a lot of efforts that could be exerted. As a matter of fact, since its independence, Algeria have chosen the track for democracy, especially after the objection of some groups and some opposition groups, because that could be related to the social values in the Algerian society. And from this part, there was something like the clash between the religious ideology and also the state ideology. There was something like armed conflict between both elements, and such conflict was still there until the 80s of the last century. But it was not effective, as we figured out after that. I have to mention also that in 1988, the crowds and the people at that time, the public, suffered from economic and social problems. There was something like social feud. So the regime at that time had a lot of problems with the people. And all of such givens were reflected in the popular uprising at that time. And there was something like conviction that there was the right time and a right time to propose a new constitution that gave the power and that gave the chance to all the people to form parties and also to have different political parties. But in fact, such a constitution did not control all the legal matters at that time. And I'm sorry to say, there were some religious parties that have something like religious ideological perspectives. But on the other hand, there were some other different parties that did not accept to have different perspectives and different ideological backgrounds, and just to take the power in order to achieve the true meaning of state and the true meaning of democratic country. So the party at that time that got the major votes, it was the Islamic Algerian Party, So in the first round of the elections, there were some opposing opinions coming from different parts inside Algeria, and they started to expose and to also explain more about their secularist and religious perspectives. Then we have to consider the army as well. There were also some opposition parties, and there were also discontent coming from the public and coming from the street. People thought at that time that the army, the military institution, they were put on the edge and they were enforced to take a tough decision to protect and to save democracy in Algeria and to protect the pluralism. So at the end, what happened, and without going into the details, without talking about the coup, we don't want to make similarities with the Egyptian example, Egyptian model. But at the end, it was taken in order to protect the democratic track in Algeria. But again, I would like just to refer to a point here that some armed militias and some parties as well, there were some practices, some violent practices. Now today we are talking about violent practices that was something out of logic and without any reasonable thinking. Such practices were weird and very strange at that time in the society. And it's different from the practices of ISIS, for example. And this was after the troubling times that was in Algeria at that time. And then the president and the prime minister of Algeria was assassinated, and a lot of people, a lot of citizens were displaced and deported, and some transportation ways were targeted as well, especially such impoverished and such shanty areas. So they were targeting everything, and they unmasked their beliefs. Such groups are not believing in democracy. They don't believe in any democratic transition. And I would like to mention also the international stance at that time. The international community did not understand the whole situation in the Algerian community. And there were some pressures on the country, on the state, and on the government to intervene. And the question was, who is killing whom? It was very perplexing situation and very confusing status at that time. They just wanted to break down the state, and they just wanted to achieve what just popular ends or popular talk. I don't want to go in details with such historical narratives that happened, but just after that, I would like to move on to the other sections that could be related to the positive democratic transitions. But I just want also to focus on how could we handle the challenge of terrorism in Algeria that we were witnessing on a daily basis every day in Algeria. And in fact, since there was transitional council that was appointed in order to promote the democratic principles, and the dialogue was including every single factor and with all the political powers, but the political powers did not consider themselves as the genuine or the true element in the process. There was also very strong emphasis inside the military that the solution or the security solution is the optimal solution, and this is the only way to eradicate terrorism. And there were some people who were believing firmly in uprooting the roots of terrorism. And here we have to consider, we have to remind ourselves again of the security solutions, that the security solutions were not just the optimal solutions when it comes to facing such challenge. And after the president was elected, after elections, President Zerwat, he called for dialogues and reconciliation, even with such armed parties and with such armed groups. So the law that was drafted at that time was calling for uh, reconciliation for such groups that they did not practice or did not perpetrate any violent actions against the state. So I can say that more than 6,000 elements from such groups, they came back to the political circles and they are working in politics nowadays. And then President Bouteflika came after that, and he suggested and he proposed a law in order to handle and process the ideological terrorist ideas. And then we have nowadays something that is called civil adaptation, and we were talking about the Colombian experience. Then we have reconciliation between the terrorist groups and the government, and in Colombian example, it was exposed to the parliament, it was ratified in the parliament, and it was also voted by the public, and 85% of the people approved it.
So now I'm giving you an idea about this law. This law allows those who surrender themselves voluntarily and give in their arms without committing any crime, he will have complete pardon without any judicial surveillance. And those who committed crimes, the judicial rules will be alleviated, and they will have some sort of ممكن نتكلم براحة شوية علشان خاطر الترجمة please. شكرا. So we talked about an initiative by President Bouteflika about civil harmony for treating the issue of those holding arms because they are extremists and they are committing acts of terrorism. He proposed the idea of the civil harmony, talking, as I said, about the Colombian experience. He proposed this law before the parliament, approved by the parliament, and then he submitted it for a referendum. He said that there is no conciliation, political conciliation, without social reconciliation. So the people must accept that project, and accordingly, the public approved it like 96%, and with a participation of like 85%, giving the opportunity to those holding arms to go back to the government, trying to protect them by the rule, according to the rule, the law of the civil harmony. Now, this law actually included some points like the armed groups should be pardoned for all those who voluntarily give in their arms in a period of 3 months. He will be prevented from any kind of punishment, and for some of them who held the arms, they will have alleviated the rules of law, the rules of the judges, and the punishment will be alleviated, so they will be incorporated in the society through some committees. And according to this law, some of the observers said that they have many facilities for these terrorist organizations, but the law wasn't actually applied strictly. And a lot of people, according to this law, submitted and give in their arms, and the state actually get back more than 6,000 pieces of weapons, and even for the Islamic army that caused the crisis also announced ceasefire, and after that for the second reconciliation, Mr. Bouteflika said that there should be a national reconciliation, and we should have the peace charter in 2005, and also releasing the political leaders of the Islamic Front, party. Also, this led to curing more comprehensively the issue of terrorism, and this including curing and treating what we call the missing file and the families of the victims and the victims of the national crisis. Everything have been treated, and also we talked about the chief of staff who said at that time that after the law of the civil harmony and reconciliation, the number of terrorists were only 700, and after the beginning of the 90s, it was 27,000. Now we can achieve a kind of stability, and Algeria was been removed from the high-risk countries list, and we encouraged investments and prevented the arming. Also, the opportunity was given to restructuring the political institutions and focusing on the rule of law and the state of law, giving the opportunity for political interaction between a lot of the political factions and groups, and give the opportunity for a general kind of reform. That's the experience of Algeria. However, we had a lot of victims. So,
can I ask you?
Yes.
It's a fascinating story, and for outsiders, it's very complicated. I'm going to ask you a simple question, and then we can work on from there. Right now, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
In fact, because, okay, let us link it to another international inputs and the other data related to the region. We have very tense places like in Libya on the coast, and also Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, still in the south. However, any kind of crisis, political crisis in Algeria will cause a lot of problems, and these groups will be more powerful and will hold arms. But now, in lots of countries, if they had the opportunity, they come back, they hold arms, and nothing has changed, because we need to reconsider the core of education and the economic and social issues that lead to violence and extremism. But if any...
Thank you. It sounds like you're only a little optimistic. I mean, it makes the point more generally that we think that we have, in some situation, ended terrorism, and we haven't. It goes on in terms of a whole series of conflicts that arise from the fundamental reasons for the terrorism in the first instance. And we can see this very clearly in the Algerian situation. And we can see this very clearly in the Algerian situation. It does, I think, make the point that if you are engaged in a battle against terrorism, then you need to be thinking about where you think you're going to get after the terrorism has subsided. It doesn't mean it's the end of the struggle. It'll go on. And you need to factor that in right at the beginning. It's no good ending terrorism without having a really good move towards a more democratic society, in particular, a kind of citizen state, I suppose. Okay, let's move on now to Dr. Azab, please. I'm not sure what you're going to talk about, but I'm sure it'll be interesting.
The experience, Egypt.
Good. Oh, I see.
brotherhood.
This is really when it comes to home, isn't it?
نحن سنتحدث عن مصر وهي العالم الإسلامي. Okay, I will speak in English and Arabic because it is a very crucial issue talking about Muslim Brotherhood and violence. Okay, the Muslim Brotherhood was established in 1928 and it is influenced by the Nazi and fascist groups in Europe, and the Muslim Brotherhood is an European influence on Egypt. This is a truth, and this is clear from the structure of the organization. The most threatening things about the organization is that they talk about the messages of Hassan al-Banna, that all the members of the group consider it as the constitution and the reference for the government. These messages haven't been reviewed by the group since its establishment up till now. The most dangerous decision of this organization when in 1940 Hassan al-Banna appointed the 5 of them to establish the armed secret organization or group affiliated to the organization to carry out the armed operation in Egypt, the most dangerous of which was the situation or was the stance taken by the group against the Jews staying in Egypt, that most of the political factions in Egypt used to think that most of the Jews must be included in the society because they are a fundamental part of the society and they shouldn't be encouraged to travel to or to go to Israel. And we had lots of places like the company of Shekorel and the cinema companies and so on. This is on one hand. On the other hand, we had lots of assassinations for Egyptian prime ministers, judges who issued rules against the Muslim Brotherhood in violence acts. And when the establisher or the founder of the organization, he said that Islam prohibits bloodshed. And he said that, so why did the organization say anything about that bloodshed caused by the government? He didn't give any sufficient response or any sufficient answer, and he didn't even resolve the secret organization affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. And he said he used an Islamic verse or a Quranic verse saying that we should intimidate the enemies of Allah. And Hassan al-Banna, when he talked about founding the secret organization, he said we need to confront the enemies, and talking like the Zionist organization in Palestine. And he also talked about a reform in the broadened sense. He wanted to make a kind of coup against the regime. Hassan al-Banna wanted to deceive others that he appointed some of the moderate groups of one of the moderate member of the group, so Sayyid Faiz, but later on he assassinated him. The structure of the Muslim Brotherhood is composed of 3 main branches: the group, the Muslim Brotherhood, the group including the guidance office, and the economic branch, like the companies owned by Muslim Brotherhood, which is it is established since the beginning of the organization, and then the social care networks, then the political commotion with different kinds of it. Also, it included a lot of organized networks since the 80s.
And also the terrorist attacks against some Egyptian interests and Egyptian locations in Egypt. Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. So we witnessed in London, according to the Romanian leader, the Romanian leaders at the time, they were talking about the terrorist ideas that were deep-rooted in certain societies that represent extremist ideas. And such ideas and the Fabian movement at that time affected and influenced the Muslim Brotherhood groups at that time as well. And also some other university professors and a lot of members from the group, they were also affected by such ideas. And so the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, with the weakness of the Egyptian state since the 70s of the last century, and with the lack and with the absence of the state institutions at that time, they were trying to spread in different sectors in the country, in the health sector, in the social sectors, and in different parts in the country. And they also tried to solve the social problems and the social troubles, and they were also trying to own other companies in order to cover financially the poor in the country. And the Muslim Brotherhood members, they were paying even from their money, from their private pocket monies, in order to provide financial support. And such fundings and such money were not covered or protected by the state. And some people moved to buy even weapons. And also we have to consider the corruption as well, the corruption of the Muslim Brotherhood members and the lack of transparency in the society. And all of such security chaos, and especially when it comes to Cairo and certain districts around Cairo, such Muslim Brotherhood group, they owned 93 companies around the world to protect and to convey their equipments. They have their members in 72 companies. That was from 1937 and until today they are still spreading. The danger of the Muslim Brotherhood group is they don't believe in homeland, they don't believe in a country, they just believe in religion, and this homeland is not considered as their part of their ideology. And so they are enclosed in their own ideas. So they are a closed group. They do not accept any outside ideas. They don't accept any external ideas. And they do not even accept any member to be included or to join the group. And if someone would like to defect the group, then they murder and they move to the way of killing him. Sometimes they move to another strategy, that is immigration and moving outside the country. And that is the ideology that was created by Sayyid Qutb, that reflected the utopian country or utopian town that was talked before by Prophet Muhammad. And so reaching the universal ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood group, it was created by the Muslim Brotherhood group founder Hassan al-Banna, and he aimed for creating a major and an expanded state. And such idea was based on and Al-Qaeda terrorist group and all other terrorist groups, they took their ideology from the founding man, that is Hassan al-Banna. There was also published a book for the Muslim Brotherhood for an author called Abu Bakr, and he said in his book that there were a universal and a global chaos in a country, in a certain country, because of the lack of the powers and because of the lack of the state and governmental institutions. And the Al-Qaeda organization should replace such a state, and they should have controlling for the governmental institutions. And at the end set up their Islamic Emirates or their Islamic State. And the Muslim Brotherhood group as well, they use different strategies in their discourse. It ranges from procrastination, and they're also the pluralization strategy. They were also talking about unilateral directions, like for example jihadist ideology, and also fighting the other inside the society, and also having a clear and obvious discourse inside the group that is a clear indication of contradiction. And that happened before. In 1952, the Muslim Brotherhood at that time, they were opposing the royal regime and they were getting their support. They were dealing with King Farouk of Egypt at that time. But at the same time, the private institutions of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were planning to have a republican system. And then that was very clear when President Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power after that. So they started to have the concept of having government from God. And they were also having certain ideas in order to make the other group non-believers. And that was the notion at that time. And during the time of President Mubarak, they called for pluralism. And they also supported the inheritance of Gamal Mubarak, the son of the president at that time. Then when the revolution started to come up in 2011, they moved with the groups, they moved with the crowds as well. So the Muslim Brotherhood did not differentiate between the government and between other states. Even the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood at that time, they were trying to explain and they were trying to show that politics is not related to one aspect in religion. And he added also that the government in Islam is the main structure for the government and for the Islamic Caliphate as well. So he considers that the Islamic Caliphate is part and parcel. It's a main component for the Islamic State. And any person who is not practicing politics or political Islam, he's not considered as a Muslim. There is troubling situation for the ideological background for the Muslim Brotherhood. And that explains why we have terrorist group like ISIS, for example. They behave in another different way because it came from the source of ideological background of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they don't accept some universal global institutions and they believe that the country or the state does not have any borders or any limits, but it should be based on the ideas and the ideologies. So we have to consider here the ideas of the Islamic groups, and at the same time, when we talk about the philosophical perspectives of the groups and also with the government's ideas, then we got at the end the Qutbi ideas that is related to Sayyid Qutb, the founding and one of the prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then we have Muhammad Badi' and we have also Mahmoud Izzat, who participated in the 60s of the last century. They were active members in the Muslim Brotherhood. Then we have Muhammad Morsi, who was also an active member in the Muslim Brotherhood, who was also involved with them to explain and to spread their extremist ideas. And they were supporting the violent actions. There are some concepts that were formulated that had a lot of meanings. For example, citizenship and the empowering of women and also the civil state. And they use such concepts in their discourse analysis. It was related to some religious and Islamic fiqh concepts, but it's not related to democratic or civil state. That can lead at the end that there is a controversy with such a group. That such controversy led at the end to other extremist groups that they could, and that's why they had a lot of extremist ideas. That's why the efforts that we are exerting here to combat and to battle terrorism is just focusing on how to study the reasons and the backgrounds of such people and why do we have such spreading ideas. And we should also have we should have our focus on some interpretations. We should have also the idea of ridda and what is and that is coming from religious perspectives. And also I suggest to open and to create different centers that can also and holding trainings, holding courses and the trainings in order to help people to overcome and to understand the extremist and fundamentalist ideas of such groups, and to also expose the teachers in Al-Azhar, in other institutions, to understand the concept and the meaning of such groups. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was very illuminating. I hadn't realized that we were talking about a group that is not concerned with the state, but with the world as a whole. I suppose the other example would be Al Qaeda is in the same bracket. You have to go back. I'm not sure where you find that occurring in history before. I suppose Trotskyism at the beginning of the last century would be an example of that. Of course, that was the big division between Trotsky and Stalin. That's the only example I can think of. But what is important about these three presentations is that it's very complicated for outsiders to begin to understand what is happening. I'm rather struck by the fact that around the tables now, we largely don't have anybody from there's only about one or two people from the Arab world around the table here. Nearly all of us around the table now are for outsiders trying to understand what is happening. And I'm very aware that Dr. Shahatab said that one of the problems was that the international community was not helpful because it didn't understand. That may be also true in Latin America. And it clearly is true in terms of Egypt. I read an intelligent newspaper, but I certainly don't understand what's happening. How do you begin to change that? How do you begin to, obviously, if you're in Egypt, you're concerned about what's happening in Egypt, and you think the rest of the world doesn't care, or maybe the rest of the world is just ignorant and not worth educating. But how do you, it is clear that in this world today, that you have to get better intelligence. I don't mean intelligence in the narrow sense, but better understanding of international community of what's happening in different parts of the world.
I think that the true story here starts from that there are some statements, some sayings that there is something happening in the current modern history of Egypt. For example, the West, some Western countries, they consider political Islam will achieve stability in the region. They do not understand what is the real meaning of political Islam, or the dimensions of political Islam, or what are the real changes that happened in Egyptian society. And that is the notion that Egypt and Egyptians believe firmly in the Egyptian national state, and that the caliphate state, the caliphate notion is over. It's over since the 1st century of Hijri Islamic year calendar. And so the selection to choose a president or a governor is to choose or to select a governor based on efficiency was not effective since that time. They suppose that there is paradise on the land, and the Western politicians, they believe that Islamic states, whether in China, from China to Morocco, they would like, this is a threat. This is a threat to the national security, because they don't believe in borders. They don't believe in nationalities. They believe that conquering Rome or invading Rome is the cornerstone. There were some prophetic sayings which are fake prophetic sayings that push Muslims to go for Rome and invade Rome. This is not true, but this is available. This is already existing in the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. I think that the Western world should read the true story of the Muslim history and of the Islamic history. They would like just to read specific or certain elements in the history. And I would say that there is a big lie when it comes to extremist Islamic groups, that the Western world, they look at such groups from another perspective, and here in the Middle East, there is another perspective.
Can I just ask you, President Brasilia, sorry, is there any kind of pan-South American activity, or is it purely either Colombian or Ecuador or Guatemalan or?
Well, I get impressed with the exposition about Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah, because I learned a lot, I think, that I didn't know, and I want to comment it because it was an excellent presentation. I appreciate a lot. Well, about a kind of Latin American pattern, I cannot talk about it. But of course, when you separate guerrilla, ideologic guerrilla, from criminal minds like in narco traffic, you can understand. But when they are mixed, you have the similar cartels of drug cartels in Mexico, in Brazil. In Brazil, not a lot of people talk about the problem of narco traffic, but it's bigger than probably in Colombia. And last few days, a cartel called PC, they don't want to move from one prison to other prison, and they criminalize everything. And Manaus, the biggest city on the Amazon jungle, that we are trying to protect the jungle, but they commit a lot of crimes inside the jails. And when we talk about what's going on the border between Mexico and United States, because United States is the big market for drugs, and Europe is a big market for drugs, also from Latin America. All Latin America is, I don't know how to use the word, permeado. It is contaminated by the narco traffic, and of course we know that it's not a thing of borders. It is a transnational issue. It's different because the religious ingredient is not present. It's not a presence, not an issue. But the crime, the narco traffic is an issue in all parts, not only Latin America, because when you see the agreements between cartels from Nigeria, from Spain, or from other parts of the world, they act like groups that are acting, making agreements, declaring wars. That's it.
And we have the same in Afghanistan and Pakistan as well.
Of course.
Dr. Serageldin, I'm sure you have some comments to make on this.
Well, yes, thank you very much, Sir Gordon. First of all, I really want to congratulate all the speakers for their excellent presentations. But I do want to pick up on the presentation of Dr. Khalid Azab, specifically on two very important points. One is that for the first time, when we have a double game going on, the first of these was that, like Samuel Huntington, who proposed a clash of civilizations, the people who agree with that are the people of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, who believe that there is a clash of civilizations and our civilization wins. And in both of these contexts, whether formulated by Huntington or formulated by Daesh and by the case of Al-Qaeda, the national boundaries do not count. National boundaries are just lines on the map. They're just lines on the map. They don't have any significance in that confrontation. Now, the Brotherhood, however, has something slightly different. The Brotherhood is playing two games. One is, it is in its own writings, as Dr. Azab showed, believing in the supranationalist or global perspective, but it is presenting that to the West as a package of saying, we will be the ones who will stabilize the situation and be able to take care of these extremists, Qaeda and Daesh, even though they are basically just a fringe group from the first one. So you have a dual situation. In fact, when, I mean, they're willing to play the game of, as happened in Egypt, winning a first step with Mr. Morsi coming to power, okay? But what did he start to do? And he started to talk about opening borders outside of Egypt, that if you have Muslims on both sides, then it really doesn't count to have a border, et cetera, which really was very problematic in that sense. So what we have is a misunderstanding in the West. Now, the problem is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy unless the Western powers begin to realize that this is a dead-end street and that you really, A, cannot manipulate these people. I mean, Mr. Sadat gave them a chance to appear and join institutions of power, and they murdered him. The Americans supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, thinking that they could control them, and look what happened to that. So these attempts do not work. That in fact, even if they start within a single state, FIS started in Algeria, now we see what's happening in Turkey, we see the consolidation of power begins to emerge, and authoritarianism comes to the fore. So we have a number of problematic issues that are there. The complexity of that issue is different from guerrillas who are trying to liberate a particular country.
Yes,
I mean, even if they are terrorists and they kill civilians and commit the acts of terror that we would refer to, but it's a very different. I mean, their scope is much narrower. Their aims are smaller. But as Khaled Azza pointed out, if you go back from 1928 onwards, on this long history of writings of the Brotherhood, you would find this repetitive pattern emerging. And it is a totally fictitious character that has no foundation in Islam, because from the Umayyad, which the period from the very first state, it was a dynastic state. It had nothing to do with a pure person being selected for merit in the caliphate, and so on and so forth. So I just really want to clarify that distinction, and that Mr. Trump and company, when they buy into the notion that it is a conflict of a clash of civilizations, and that you are really fighting out the whole thing, they are in fact bringing support to the perspective within the Muslim countries that says
playing the same game.
They're bringing support to the perspective inside the Muslim countries that says, see, we can never coexist with these guys. It's a clash of civilizations. It is, and so on.
Dr. Shattab, is the Muslim Brotherhood active in Algeria and the other Maghreb states? Is that right?
هو بالفعل أنه ربما هذا ما لم أشر له في ما تحدثت به. خلفية هذه الجماعات الفكرية هو امتداد لحركة الإسلام أو الإخوان المسلمون في مصر، وهذه الحركة في الحقيقة لم تبقى محدودة في مصر، بل لها امتدادات في كل المنطقة العربية. وكتابات الذين تحدث عنهم الدكتور، الكثير من الكتابات هي امتدت وانتشرت على جميع هذه المنطقة. لذلك قلنا أن المواجهة الفكرية ضرورية، وأن هذه الجماعة فعلا لا تؤمن بفكرة الوطن، ولكنها تؤمن بالدولة التي تشمل الكل، وبالتالي لم تبقى فكرهم فقط منحصرا في مصر، بل امتد إلى دول عربية، ولو وجدوا الفرصة لامتد إلى كل العالم.
Thank you. I'm just going to finally come to you, Ms. Shahira. I mean, you've been listening to this very carefully. And is there any comment you wanted to make on what's been said? I mean, any...
Well, I was just going to wrap up and bring up the most important points that we heard from Dr. Rosalia. She emphasized on educating the public on inclusion, tolerance, use of technology, and she also emphasized creativity and coming up with new ideas to tackle the challenge. So that's the most important thing that came out of her talk. Dr. Lubna outlined the Algerian experience and the clash between the religious ideology and the state, the years of turmoil there, and how did Algeria tackle the problem? By appointing a transitional council, but then an initiative for civil harmony. And that was approved with overwhelming support from the population, as I understood. And it allowed the country to reintegrate groups that did not incite or commit acts of violence, and those that chose to lay down their arms. Dr. Khalid Azab spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood, their history and their ideology, and how the group evolved through the years. And he outlined the grave threat posed by the group, one being that they are their supranationalist ideals and the idea of creating an Islamic caliphate, and their links, possible links with other terrorist groups that are committing acts of violence in Egypt. I'm afraid not many solutions came out of this. I think we asked more questions than we posed solutions, but perhaps in the next 2 days we'll be coming up with new ideas for solutions. Perhaps the only solution was the question of reconciliation, and you said that there has to be societal reconciliation before there is political reconciliation. So that could be one.
Yeah, thank you. That's quite a good conclusion. I'm not going to try and summarize in any way. Thank you for doing that. Coming as very much an outsider to this part of the world, and also an outsider, in fact, in terms of South America, is just how complicated the situations are and how important it is that those of us who are outside understand better than we do at the moment. It would be very good, clearly we can't do that, but it'd be very good to get the texts of what all three of you have said. And I know you've all got handwritten notes. It would be helpful to people like myself to be able to read those and think about them and digest them. You all spoke from greater authority, often rather fast, I might say, and it's quite difficult to understand what is happening, but we all do need to get a better handle on it, and I hope we can do so more during the rest of the meeting. I'd like to thank all three of you for being part of this panel. I'd like to thank my rapporteur too, and thank you also, Ismail, for giving us the opportunity to be here.
Sir Conway, thank you for your excellent chairmanship.
Thank
you very much.
And so, as I promised Ismail we would finish before 7:30, we have caught up with the program now.